This is the Veterinary Project Podcast, episode 143.
Welcome to the show created by vets featuring absolutely no pets. This is the Veterinary Project Podcast, hosted by Dr. Michael Bugg and Dr. Jonathan Light. Our resident veterinarians have swapped out their stethoscopes in favor of microphones to bring you the Veterinary Project Podcast, a show focused on real conversations, aimed to connect this amazing profession full of remarkable people. Through the sharing of collective stories and wisdom, and connecting over the many unique challenges we face, we invite you to join our community of veterinary professionals leading intentional lives. And now, here are the hosts of the Veterinary Project Podcast, Dr. Michael Bugg and Dr. Jonathan Light.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Veterinary Project Podcast. Great episode today, diving into anxiety and stress with Tim JP Collins. But before we get there, a little banter with my boy Jonathan. What's happening?
Dude, you brought the heat today. I'm really enjoying our 2023-2024 lineup. This has been really good. Another interesting gentleman, new to me over the past couple of weeks of getting to know him and his content, and will be extremely useful to many listeners in our world. So kudos to you. Kudos to Tim.
I'm very excited for this one. I met Tim personally in 2014, I believe it was, at a real estate conference. That's when I got introduced to some of his work and started following his anxiety podcast. I said to him after we turned record off, but in lots of ways, he's an inspiration to me in how he has just continually designed his life, right? And we get into it in the podcast about looking for alignment. And he still very much enjoys doing difficult things, but they have to align with him. And I just think it's so simple, but it's so brilliant.
And yet aligns with what you're trying to do year in, year out. And again, how has that process gone for getting into 2024?
Yeah, well, I mean, it always iterates, right? As it does, which is probably the way it should be. And so currently I'm lining up some of the things that I'm aiming for. I just put out a social media story kind of officially committing sometime in 2025 or 26. I don't know when I'll get to do that Everesting, 29029, because Mount Everest is 29,000 feet, right?
What are you talking about?
So
I've been off social media again. I'm totally out of it. He mentioned it on the podcast. I feel better by not having it, but I also miss out on the world now, it seems.
Yeah. So
loop us in. What does this mean?
This is with one of my buddies from my mastermind group. And so Everesting 29029, they happen all over the world. The premise is you have to climb the equivalent height of Mount Everest on whatever mountain you choose to do it on. So just to clarify, it's not like vertical mountain climbing. It's more like aggressive hiking. So me and my buddy are probably going to do it in Whistler, BC. And in Whistler, BC, you have to climb that mountain 8 times in a 36-hour period. I think you get 36 hours to complete it, right? So the punchline is it's very challenging, apparently, right? I told my trainer about this and he was like, wow, you have to train for this seriously. So this is 25, 26. This is in a few years. This isn't tomorrow.
So Mike lives in the flatlands of Saskatoon. And all I could think of was how many thousands of times he was going to have to go up and down Blackstrap to make that going. That's why I've got my stupid grin while you're telling me this. 8 times going up and down Whistler in 36 hours.
Apparently, according to the website.
You're going to get your 40 minutes? Less than 40 minutes? Or you put that to the side in order to get this one?
I'm going to take another crack at it this year. Yeah. And I mean, I've said this before, but ultimately all these health things that I do, I kind of just refer to them now as milestones. They're fun challenges, but really they just keep me active and outside, and I look forward to it. So in the spirit of the conversation that's coming here with Tim, they are difficult, but they're in alignment with what I like doing.
Absolutely. And doing one of them or even going towards one of them is going to improve so many other facets of your life. So kudos to you.
How about you? I'm not letting you off the hook. You got to give us something. What's something in your
word
world?
of the day? I'm into looking at 2024. So right now, as we record this, it is all about strategy within the company and looking at what 2024 looks like for execution. And really proud of the team. We have done a lot of work. It does not come overnight. So there has been a lot of thought, strategy, debate, tough choices. So, as we're going to talk about today, in my role of CEO, you're guiding that vision. You're making sure that the right people are in place and the execution can be deliverable for, again, we've talked about this in veterinary medicine. It's a different market than it was in 21, 20. Doesn't mean that there isn't opportunity. There's a lot of opportunity, and now it's setting it up. So this podcast is really relevant because when I am both accountable and have my team executing and we are together in sync and or can debate effectively and with respect when we're not, that's when I feel less anxiety. So it's been a good last couple of weeks because of the amount of hard work we're doing right now. And it's not easy, and it keeps me up at night. So without a doubt, continuing the trend of work.
Nice. So yeah, I mean, let's dive in because this is a good one for all of our listeners. Even though Tim comes from the real estate world, that's where Tim and I met. We're diving into anxiety and stress today. So Tim's real estate experience is significant. After catching the investing bug in the UK, Tim continued upon arriving in Canada. In Ontario, he ran a real estate investing business focusing on highly desirable student rental properties close to large universities. Tim recently spent 3 years working in the real estate technology industry, working with agents in North America to set up lead generating platforms and teaching them how to market listings for maximum results. Tim went on to be an agent closing 50 sales in his first year. Tim has built a large online presence with a number of projects, one of which is his podcast, The Anxiety Podcast, focusing on reducing stress and anxiety, which has over 3 million downloads. And I know when Jonathan and I were hitting record, we're like 3 million downloads. Like, this is a library. This is a fantastic resource for all of us in the veterinary community. Head on over there, check it out. I know I've jumped into lots of his episodes, very valuable. So let's get to it. I give you Tim J.P. Collins. All right, Tim, thanks for joining us on the Veterinary Project Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Likewise. This is going to be a good one. We were just saying here before we hit record. So we're diving into all things anxiety and stress. And one of my core intentions with having you on is just to get you introduced to the veterinary world because it's a phenomenal resource. And I think this is really going to land. So thank you for coming here. Thank you for what you've done. So the Anxiety Podcast, over 500 episodes. And I think you said over 3 million downloads. So we have a wealth of knowledge here today.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's been a long road for sure.
Yeah. Both Jonathan and I scrolled all the way back, first episode, August 2015, and dove in there. So yeah, it has been quite a journey. Could you, for our audience, maybe just, summarize your story, and you can dive in wherever you feel inclined to?
Yeah. So it's a long story, so feel free to cut me off because I can talk at length about this. But I kind of feel like I had a very average upbringing, well, exceptional, thanks mum and dad, but average in terms of like, I didn't have any sort of massive trauma in my family. The expectation was to go to university. I didn't go to university. 2 of my siblings did, but it was very traditional in that we kind of were thinking about, right, how do we get a good job and get a career and get a house and start to build resources and money and stuff like that. So that was always on my mind. And often when my dad phoned me up, the first thing he said was like, how's work going? And so that I knew that was important, right? That's the way I was kind of wired. I've since given him feedback that wasn't probably the best question to ask me all the time. But anyway, I got into that. I very much got into that world of like building out, doing well at work, getting promoted, getting a pay rise. Then that would in turn make me spend a bit more money. And so I got on that usual trajectory of make more, buy more until I kind of built up this collection of things that I was responsible paying for. And my job got progressively a bit more stressful, more travel, late nights out, entertaining people and doing things. And what I didn't pay attention to through any of that time is kind of what I actually wanted to do. I was just kind of very much on that treadmill of, get more and build up some wealth kind of thing. And so I neglected my physical health pretty much and neglected my mental health. Back in those days, anxiety was kind of a bad word. I think in following the pandemic, it's not as bad as it was, but I think that it was definitely something that people didn't want to talk about.
And what year would you be speaking about there? Sorry, Tim, to jump in there, but what year would that be where, you're feeling like you're getting on the hamster wheel more and more?
Yeah, so my sort of career started in, let's say, 2000. And then by 2010 years into that, I was ready to snap.
Sure.
And then I did.
Yeah.
So right on time. I mean, there was lots of good things about my job. I was in technology sales. So there was fun trips and nice people and stuff, and definitely good aspects to it. But the bad ended up outweighing the good. And sort of the perfect storm happened where I kind of been working a lot and drinking a lot because we often went out with clients after work and had a few drinks. And that was kind of a way to numb the pain a little bit. It was, I always, now on reflection, I can see so clearly what I was doing, but I always used to look forward to Fridays so much. Happens to be Friday today when we're recording this, but I used to look forward to Fridays so much because I knew I could just go and get drunk after work and not worry about anything for a couple of days. And then you just rinse and repeat on Saturday, Sunday hungover, and then you go back to work again. So that was very normal for me. But anyway, one day I'm back in England doing a presentation, and I've been out the night before, had a few drinks, got up, smashed the Starbucks on the way to the meeting. And as I stood up there to launch into my presentation, I had my first ever significant panic attack, and it hit me like a truck. Like I just didn't know, all these sort of weird sensations going on in my body around shame and embarrassment being the two defining ones at that point, because I was standing up in front of people and I literally couldn't talk. Like I couldn't say anything. Nothing was functioning. So that was like a very hard slap in the face. In that moment, I felt like my life was ending to some extent. I know that sounds very dramatic, but it was like so much of my life had been built around this career and success and expectations and performance and stuff. For me not to be able to do it, my mind raced straight to the end game of like, now you're going to get fired, then you lose your job, people won't love you, and you're a failure. That was a hard day. Yeah, that was the beginning of me having to sort of take a real deep dive into my life, and that led to years of me trying to figure it out. And I had some suicidal thoughts when I was going through that time, because I just thought like I didn't feel like I could reach out and ask for help. I was very much like, when you listen to people say, just ask somebody for help, in that moment, I didn't feel like I could. It was just too embarrassing. I was like just embarrassed by the whole situation and didn't want to ask anybody for anything. So that was the kind of beginning point. And then do you want me to go on to tell you a bit about what happened next?
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't want to, sit on that too much, but I do want, like, in listening to your episode, I could feel it, right? As you were describing, like the feelings in your body and the sweat and the heat and, and you're trying to talk, but you can't talk. And it just seems like, in my words, I would be like, wow, you're like a prisoner in your body and your mind, right? And you just want out and to escape. When I'm listening to you talk today and I'm looking at you and you tell the story of, we're drinking too much and you get drunk on Friday and then you're hungover and you deliver it so confidently. And so on one hand, 2010 Tim talks a lot about shame and embarrassment. And when I'm looking at 2023, 2024, Tim, I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing confidence and, vulnerability, but you're glowing, right? I'm just so curious. How did you get there? I know that that's a huge question, a huge conversation, but it's amazing.
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you. I appreciate that. And it is the most important thing I've ever done in my life to make those changes. It made me think of a time when on one of my sales calls, I was in Vegas at this point at a conference, and I would normally dial into the weekly sales meeting. I was the sales director, so I had to present the numbers. There's the CEO on the phone and the CFO and all these other people. And I went into the bathroom to make this phone call because my wife was traveling with me. And they said, right, Tim, give us the sales update. I couldn't say anything. I had like an Eminem moment. I just couldn't. Another occasion where I was like, oh. So as an anxious person, if something happens to you once, it's horrific. But if it starts happening again, then you think you're like chronically broken, right? Then you think, well, this is like, and then your whole mind, your whole life is narrated by what if happens now? What if happens now? What if I can't do this? My son got christened, went to his christening at the church, and I was like standing there just sweating, and everybody else isn't sweating because it was kind of a cold, damp church. And they're like, are you all right? And I was like, yeah, maybe it was something I ate. I don't know. Like, it's just that whole situation. So that was tough beginnings. And very quickly after that, I kind of went to the doctor, as you do, and say, hey, I've got this mental health condition, need to be fixed. Without any effort at all, just gave me sort of anti-anxiety or antidepressant type pills. Said, take those for a month. They'll take a while to start working. And then if those ones don't work, just come back and we'll give you something different. But this is basically the solution. They didn't ask me about my diet, my sleep, my relationships, my health, my work, anything, which now I know is the solution. But at the time, I thought, yeah, just take the pills. And I took them for probably a week. And then I said to my wife, like, this just doesn't feel like it's the right thing to do. I don't feel good with this in my body. And obviously, as you do, you go on to Google and type in antidepressants and you see like suicidal thoughts. And I was like, I've already got that. Don't need more. So that worried me. I'm probably fearful of taking unnecessary medication anyway. But yeah, sleep has always been I think it's even today is such an under-respected factor of how well we feel. And I definitely wasn't getting quality sleep back then. So I kind of, after realizing that medication wasn't the answer, I started just going through my life and saying like, how can I make myself feel better again? And literally, I was exasperated with trying to solve this problem. It took me years to figure it out, but I just went sort of systematically through each thing that might have made sense. So cleaned up my diet, changed that completely, basically stopped drinking alcohol, makes a massive difference, which now I say that is bloody obvious, but at the time you just think, well, it can't be that. Started working out regularly. And then the other big thing came to like, and now that I say this, now that I think about this in real time, I think I've been chasing this for my whole life. And Mike, you and I met at a real estate investing event 10 years ago nearly. Part of my search was to try and replace my employment income with passive income so that I could find that solitude and that freedom in not being responsible to, I mean, the truth is that I was like, if I could replace my passive income, I won't have to stand in front of people and talk anymore. I can totally bypass this experience in life. So yeah, there was lots of things that, and through the visit to the West Coast, which was part of that time, I decided that maybe where I lived wasn't fully supporting me and a change of scenery might be a good thing. So I left and did that. Each of these things had their own massive baggage associated with them. My kids were in private school at the time. I said to my wife, like, private school was $1,000 each per kid or something. And I said, like, I built this, I think of them as like golden handcuffs, right? And so anybody who's had success and made or been in a career, and definitely as veterinarians, if you're listening to this, you invested a lot of time in getting to a place where you can now reap the rewards in terms of income. But with that comes these golden handcuffs in terms of then you start living that life. And for me, that was house in the country, new car for my wife and I, kids in private school. And as my world started to crumble, I thought, how am I going to pay for all this stuff if I can't do the job anymore? That's the ultimate pressure. And so as painful as it was, I just went through each of the things and like undid them all, sold the house, left the job, took the kids out of private school, sold the cars. Like I just looked at my expense line in my thing and just like, how can I get this down to as little as possible while I'm in this sort of healing phase of my life, right? So that's what I did. I just went through, and I think my family look at me and think I'm impulsive or something in terms of making changes, but I just was like, I can't live, at the time I was 35 maybe, I can't live another 30 years of suffering like this. It's not gonna work for me.
Tim, I want to dive in. I'm picturing, people seeing you externally, and some of the things they would probably say is like, Tim's a high performer. He's so successful. And you would have all the check marks. Like you said, the house, the cars, the kids in private school, just across the board. People would probably look at you and be like, I want that life. He has it made.
Yeah.
And then you very consciously decide, I am going to dismantle this piece by piece. And it's the right choice for you, but you have to deal with what everyone thinks of that, right? You have to talk to your parents and tell them, okay, I'm leaving my job. You have to go to the private school and be like, hey, we're pulling the kids out. How did you deal with that? Because I've heard you speak a lot about how much we care what other people think. And ultimately, at some point, we have to let that go to a degree.
Yeah. It's an interesting reflection of the way we respond as humans. So I think this is a cool insight. I once interviewed this lady on my podcast, and she made this comment which has stuck with me ever since. And she said that people never knew she was anxious because she looked so good. Like she would spend so much time doing her hair and makeup, and off she went into the world. And she said for her, like, the better she looked on the outside, the worse she felt on the inside. And that's why now when I look at people who are having extreme success, yeah, maybe everything's fine and everything's great, but I know through my own experience and having spoken to hundreds, if not thousands of people at this point, that like everybody's dealing with something in their life. It might be related to their work, their relationship, their self-image, their mental health, their physical, their image of their body, or that sort of thing. But everybody has struggles that they're dealing with. It's just part of being human. And to say that somebody's got it made and everything's fine is just not the case. And so, yeah, I just went through, again, I was kind of like, when you do something and you get good results, in my case, I was taking bricks off of my shoulders. And I was like, oh, that feels a bit better. But still, this side is really heavy. And then I take another one off. And I was like, that feels a bit better. And so everything I did, I was just getting positive reinforcement. I was unshackling myself from all these obligations. And one of my favorite films of all time is Fight Club, because there's just so many good quotes in there. But one of them sticks out for me, which is what you own owns you. And one of my old bosses,
philosopher Tyler Durden.
Yeah, right. Or only once you've lost everything are you totally free. Like I remember those types of things. And I used to have a boss who was very successful, multi-millionaire guy. And I said, you got everything, you got the money, the house. And he's like, yeah, but I still have to he's like, this is a machine I have to take care of. Even if I have somebody to clean the pool, I still got to pay that person and remember to set up the appointment. He said, it's just, and he used to say that what you own owns you. So if you've got a house in the Muskokas in a downtown condo and an extra car or a side job, or everything needs feeding and watering and maintenance and taking care of. So we might think that having an extra place or more stuff, or even like investment properties and income properties, they're great passive income. It's not really, even if it doesn't require your physical time, it's still taking up space in your head. And so definitely with some of those influences, I moved towards a life of more simplicity, less complexity, and just moving in that direction.
So this is
Mike,
a great
can
spot. Sorry, I have to
jump
go on this one. No, I have to
Okay,
go on
then
this
I'm jumping after. I love it.
Tim, ever since we had you lined up to officially record this, this is the number one question I've wanted to ask you, because part of your story as we go on is you move to the West Coast and you sell everything. So you and I met at a real estate investing conference.
Yes.
And in the real estate investing world, more is better. And I'm saying this highly sarcastically for our listeners, but there is a tendency as you start acquiring rentals, you take that and you buy more and you buy more and you buy more. You move across the country, you sell all your rentals, you sell your personal home. And in the summer of 2023, I heard you say on a podcast, you owned nothing, no investment real estate. You were renting. You didn't even own a personal house. You had no car payments, no debt of any kind. When I heard that, I felt lighter. I was like, holy, this man is a genius. So number one, how did that first day feel? You like when you sell the last obligation, how free did you feel?
This might sound a bit philosophical, but yeah, I found very free. And it's weird because I'm a realtor, so I help people buy and sell houses all the time, and people ask my opinion on things. But when I sold my last house, which was the one I was living in, it just felt like, it felt like very liberating. And I think of, when I work with people and they say we want to buy our forever home, nothing's forever. We're not here forever. Everything's temporary. The crown owns the land that the houses are built upon. It kind of reverts back to that. But yeah, it just felt like, obviously I still got to buy food and I have to have somewhere to sleep and house my family. But I just love the flexibility of not being tied down to, let's say that I didn't sell my house and then the real estate market changes and now I'm ready to move, but my house is worth less. And being outside of that for myself and for my peace of mind based on my history is just exceptional. And so, yeah, that's kind of end game, right? Like I started with all these obligations and I've ended up with nothing. Now, I did have some fortune in the interim. Like I hear a lot of people talk about kind of gaining wealth and how they did it and all these things. Well, I did all the things and took all the action, but I also had the great fortune of market timing being on my side. When I was buying real estate in around that 2010, let's say 2010 to 2020, that was a good decade of real estate appreciation. I took action, I bought places, I sold them again over time. And so I benefited from that. And I'm very grateful that worked out in a good decade. It wasn't just me. It was the time that happened. So I saved money and put stuff away. Just that not having a credit card debt, not having any credit lines or mortgage or anything. Like I just don't own anything ever. Now when I pay something on my credit card because I want to get the points, I just go in the next week and pay it off to zero again. And that, it feels good to have nothing. I think I heard somebody say like the best option is the option to have more options. And I think of that choice that I can move and go somewhere else and do something different. I don't have to wait for permission from anybody else to make that happen.
Good for you, Tim. I mean, it's very stoic, but very wise of you to recognize that you have enough and not chase more, which is so common. So anyway, sorry, Jonathan, I'll let you jump in. I had to ask him that.
I love it. And I'm actually going to do a follow-up and then I'm going to have to go backwards. So this is a follow-up and very reminiscent of a recent podcast you did. And I took this quote down because I really loved it. And I'd love you to go into it a little bit more. Your comment directly was accountability mixed with vulnerability and work is what changes lives. That quote you use for those that are trying to go through this same process. And you do now group coaching and you work with individuals that have anxiety, etc. Tell me a little bit more about that combination because I really liked it and it speaks to what you're describing right now.
Yeah, I think accountability, the first point of that is key because in whether you're in business, sales, anything, people need support to change. I had some myself in the early days and just sometimes we just need permission to do something different. Now, the person that back then that I was asking for permission for didn't say like, quit your job, sell your house, move across the country and sell everything. But the actual thing that lit the torch was I just said, do you think my job could be partly responsible for the way that I feel? And their response was, well, why don't you leave your job and see how you feel? So that was the first external permission from somebody else who was thinking straight to say like, yeah, leap and see what happens, right? And then I got kind of addicted to change and improving things after that. And then vulnerability is the second important ingredient, because definitely historically in my upbringing, vulnerability wasn't necessarily rewarded. It was something that you kind of don't tell people if you're not feeling well or you don't feel up to it or any of that kind of stuff. And as we know, like the people in our lives we have the closest relationships with are the people we're also most vulnerable with. Way wrong, vulnerability isn't super powerful, but if somebody reciprocates, then you have a relationship, right? I'm going to tell you something, and you see this happen in like AA and places like that, where people share deep parts of their life and other people reciprocate and they build very tight bonds because you're letting somebody see past the mask for a minute, and then you'll see them past theirs and you have that real connection. So vulnerability is delicate because you have to be respectful. You can't just show up and meet somebody for the first time and say, let me tell you all my problems, because that isn't attractive. But so it's very gentle, it's very subtle, it's got to be paced correctly. But when it's done that way, it really does build relationships at a much deeper level. And often somebody needs to go first. And because of my putting stuff out on my podcast, a lot of the time I meet people and they're like, oh, they kind of instantly know that the door is open to have that type of conversation because I've shared so much about myself. And then that means that you kind of get there quicker, right? You can build that relationship faster. So yeah, and it doesn't need to be with a coach or therapist even, but like taking time to get outside of the normal day-to-day to facilitate a deeper conversation with somebody that's in your life is really powerful. So if it's a family member you want to connect with more, it's like going for a walk outside is great because you could ideally leave the phones behind and put them away and just have dedicated time to talk is powerful.
What suggestions do you recommend, Tim, for those that maybe have not improved or opened themselves up vulnerably, that are in the early stages where you were in 2010, that may find themselves there in veterinary medicine right now and don't know what to do next, don't know how to take those next steps? How do you suggest they go about it when they know they're in the same spot that you are, or were, I should say?
First of all, I would say that like if you ignore it, it's not going to go away. So if you get into like having a bottle of wine on a Friday and thinking like I'll just suck it up and carry on, like that is a short-term solution, which ends up catching up with you. So I kind of think of this analogy, which I use quite regularly, which is that if you're driving a car and you don't put air in the tires and you don't put new tires on it and the suspension wears down and you drive it over rocks and all that stuff, after enough time, the steering wheel starts shaking, right? But the steering wheel isn't shaking because the steering wheel's broken. The steering wheel is shaking because you've neglected your car. And anxiety is the steering wheel in this example, in that anxiety in and of itself isn't the problem. It is symptomatic of neglect across your life in one or many areas, which is manifesting in the way that you feel. So if you're in the early stages of feeling like this, my recommendation is to like take some time to think about what are your wheels that you're neglecting in your life. Could it be a relationship that you're in and don't feel great about it, but you're carrying on anyway? Or in the case of, I don't want to speak out of school because this isn't my profession, but if you spent a large portion of your 10 years to become a vet and you don't really like it, or you're in the wrong practice, or you're in the wrong geographic area, or it's not feeling right, or working for the wrong group of people, those are the things which you got to kind of dig into and start to investigate and try and get to the root cause of it. Because all things being equal, if you're feeling good and you're doing something that you love and you're with people that love you, you're probably not going to feel anxious in the same way. I'm a sensitive person, so I think I'm definitely more likely to get anxiety if somebody's going to get it because I'm very empathetic, I'm very sensitive. I think I got that from my mum. She's very similar. So we feel a lot of external stuff that's going on. So yeah, if you're also wired the same way, then you need to sort of take a look at things and try and understand. Now when I look back on it, now I can feel it coming. That's why I'm saying this, because if I don't sleep well, I don't even really drink very much these days. I might have the odd beer here and there, but let's say I have a few beers or when I wake up with a bit of a hangover and so a few things compound, I can feel it coming on. And then I can just sit there and say, right, why am I feeling this? Oh, because I'm working with a new client who's kind of taking advantage of me. And I feel like that's encroaching on my boundaries. And so I've either got to let them go and say, we're not a good fit to work together, have a tough conversation, And that's why we don't do it, because often we need to take some measure to change, which is going to be difficult. You kind of have to go through more pain to find sunshine on the other side. But again, I've got well schooled at that now. So it's really just trying to feel where the origin is and then making changes.
Thank you.
Tim, I got a question in there. So sort of in my words, I'm looking at this with anxiety and thinking, okay, we have the symptoms and we seem to have tools out there to address the symptoms.
Yes.
But they're not addressing the root cause. And in a perfect scenario, you know, we dig deep, we find the roots. Okay, this is what's causing the anxiety. So in your example, we're going to go fix the actual tires and we move on.
Yes.
However, as you said, it can be very painful. So for someone that's already feeling a lot of pain, and then to kind of know that they have to go experience even more potentially to dig up these roots, I guess let's start with what are a few tactical tools to help with the symptoms. Now, we know this is not going to be the 100% fix all, but it will help give a bit of relief and hopefully create the space so that they can go deal with the root issue. So I guess the question would be, what would be some of your top tips to just manage an acute episode of anxiety?
Yeah. I think, like you said, there are a lot of the solutions are kind of like, I always think of the analogy of like a fire alarm going off, and instead of going to put the fire out, we just close the door or throw a blanket over it or build a bigger wall so we don't hear the noise. Meanwhile, that's still going on. So yeah, if you're in the midst of it at the moment, I think the first thing to think about is to sort of self-care items. So you can't work through it very well. So it would definitely be like, can you take some time off work so that you can have a break from that external stress? Prioritize sleep. Don't drink alcohol or take drugs. Those are definitely both massive things that are just going to make it worse because of the way that they kind of bring us down, you know? So those are the first couple of things I would start thinking about doing. Definitely, this sounds like such an underrated thing, but had such a massive difference for me. And people I worked with is going for walks outside in nature without your phone and without anybody else. That time, so much of what we do now is, and probably people listening to this are walking along thinking, hey, I'm doing that now. But so much of our time is like optimizing. How do we learn more or be better in personal growth or finances or education? So we're always consuming stuff, but having a bit of a digital detox where you can put the phone away, particularly if you're in a practice where you're on call and your phone might ring at any point and you have to run out and do something. So finding gaps in your day where you can turn your phone off and put it away and go for a walk outside for an hour and just allow things to process. I think about my life. There aren't a lot of gaps in a day where I'm not sort of actively accessible by somebody else. My phone could ring, kids want to talk to me, I got them doing stuff on the computer, we're watching a movie, there's always stimulation. So it's removing some of those things so that you can allow your time, your body and mind time to sort of heal and process what's going on. That's huge. And then outside of that, I definitely think exercise for me was a big one as well. So I know a lot of people in the real estate profession are sort of struggle to find time in a day to do exercise because, you know, once you get going, you get some momentum and things start to happen. So for me, at that point, it became reprioritizing exercise. So I'd go in the morning or I'd go at lunchtime. If you said, what's the best time for you to work out? I'd probably say like 11, wake up, have a coffee, and then go and do my workout. Now, that doesn't always work in my day because of the way things go. But again, if you're not putting yourself first in your life, then this is how we got to where we are. So you have to start doing some of these things to say, I'm investing in exercise, I'm investing in my sleep and what I eat. I mean, animals are a great example because if you had like a thoroughbred racehorse, you wouldn't give it McDonald's and expect it to win the Grand National, right? But as humans, we eat all this processed crap and wonder why we don't feel great. And that adds up over time. So I went big into sort of diet and really, without going down another rabbit hole, because that's a whole other episode, but simple things like paleo diet's a pretty good foundation to start, of like stuff that grows and you can buy. And if you eat meat, then as I do, some quality meats, and just keep it simple, right? If somebody came along and said, this is what I'm suffering with, those are the areas I would start with. They're not fashionable, they're not fast. It's not some kind of tapping trick or meditation that's going to fix you in 5 minutes, because likely you didn't get that way in 5 minutes, right? So to try and think you could have a fast solution for something that's built up over a lifetime or years is unreasonable. It's the solution to anxiety is everything you do contributes to it in a positive or negative way. So the other thing might be relationships. This is a really interesting one. I once had a conversation with a lady who said she was in a physically abusive relationship, like a boyfriend hit her And she asked me if I thought that was why she was anxious. And I said, well, much like the advice I'd given, or I'd been given years before, I said, well, why don't you leave the relationship and see if you feel better, right? Turns out it was a big part of her anxiety. She had literal anxiety of being afraid of getting slapped. Sometimes when we're in these, I tell you that story to say that sometimes when we're in the midst of these things, we can't see necessarily the best thing for ourselves. And so that's why it's kind of going back to this sort of simple approach of taking care of ourselves, looking at the work we do and how that impacts it. Definitely people I've spoken to over the years who do shift work. Shift work is extremely hard on our mental health because of our circadian rhythm. It's horrific to get woken in the middle of the night and have to go and perform something difficult. And if that happens again and again over years, then it's just hard. It's just very hard to constantly be out of sync.
A question I have, Tim, is when I hear your story, you have done a lot to reduce friction or anxiety in your life. Yet at the same time, you continually dive in to uncomfortable things. So for example, I know you by now you're probably fluent in Spanish, but once upon a time you were learning Spanish. You and your wife travel a lot. I believe you're into martial arts of some sort.
Yeah.
And you speak a lot about like when you start these things, they're horrifically uncomfortable. And you're a novice, you're a rookie, like 0 out of 10 competence in them. So I'm so curious how someone who has experienced high degrees of anxiety and has continually checked things off the list to deal with them, but then intentionally throws themselves into anxious situations. That is fascinating to me because it's all in you're growing. So I just would like you to speak to that.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know if I felt anxious learning Spanish, but definitely like when you start, it's kind of like, I used to watch movies in Spanish on Netflix and I just didn't understand any of it. I would just watch it because I watched this YouTube video by this guy who said you should just acquire a language like a child instead of learning it. And kids would just watch TV. So I watched Shrek in Spanish all the time. And it's a weird thing because to start with, you don't understand anything. And now fast forward where I do understand, you're watching the same thing through a different lens, right? So it's interesting, but I've always liked doing difficult things. I just now realize that like growth in myself requires discomfort before you get to the good stuff. And that's been the same in investing. Think back to the early days in the real estate game. I didn't know anything, didn't know anybody, didn't know how to buy a house or flip a house or get tenants or any of those things. Sometimes my kids say like, well, it's really difficult now. And I'm saying, yeah, but I would figure it out now. If I had to go and do it again, I would network with the right people, find out how to borrow money, look for good opportunities. I just think that some of these things, if you dive into them and they're hard to start with, if you can learn it, there's huge upside. The most difficult thing I've done recently is jujitsu because it hits you in so many different ways. Physically, it's very painful at times when somebody's got their knee on your belly with a whole 200 plus pounds of weight and they're leaning into you as hard as they can, or you're getting choked or something like that. It's physically very uncomfortable. But sometimes when you are underneath somebody and they're straddled on top of you and they're just holding you down with all their weight and you can't get out, you feel so helpless. And at the same time, you've got to try your best to make something of that. It's such an ego killer. I think that's why it's a weird sort of love-hate thing. Yesterday, interestingly, I was rolling with my son who's 16 and he got me, I've been doing it a bit longer than him or a bit more regularly than him, but he got me in an arm bar. And I had this moment in my mind where I was like, I've got a tat. I was like, I thought like I created this person and now they're trying to break my arm. It's just a weird circle of life. But in that moment, I was like, if I tap to him, then I can't. So I actually like tried a bit harder for a bit longer to get out of it because that's the ego, right? Who cares if I have to tap because it's uncomfortable? And some days you get submitted multiple times and I walk out of there just thinking I should just quit because I can't do it. But that's what also makes it beautiful because it's very hard and it takes black belt, which is extreme competency, takes at least 10 years of going very regularly. It's just a very hard thing to do.
So Tim, I'm still just myself working through this. I'm trying to parse it out. So would it be fair to say, having less anxiety does not mean living a life of ease, right? Like total comfort and shying away. Because I love how you said you still enjoy doing difficult things.
Yes.
And so I guess is the magic punchline in there, the anxiety is flaring up if it's a difficult thing that's just out of alignment, right? Like when it's in total alignment, jujitsu with your son, it's hard, but in alignment.
Yeah, it's totally, absolutely. Yeah, difficult things that you're doing difficult things, but they are out of alignment with you or taking you in the wrong direction, or we just know deep down that some things are just bad for us. And it might be a job situation or a relationship or a habit we have or something, but we just know that they're bad. And that's where anxiety is a beautiful thing. If you think about it, it's like an early warning system that's like built into you. If you didn't have anxiety, you'd probably be dead because you would have stepped out in front of a car or you wouldn't have protected yourself. So this like early warning system sometimes just gets out of whack if you keep doing things which are bad for it and not recognizing or ultimately listening to the warning signs. Then that's where it kind of gets broken and wonky and starts to show up even when you're not anxious. Like you're watching TV with your kids and you feel all of a sudden start having a panic attack. What's going on? It's because it's kind of dysregulated because it hasn't been heard. I know some of this stuff sounds weird, but I've been through this with so many people, and every single person I've ever coached or spoken to, with enough time, we've got to the bottom of this in terms of like, there's something which is making this happen. This didn't just pop up from nowhere. If you went from not having anxiety, for instance, and life's all right, to having anxiety, it's likely from something you've done or some experience that you continue to have. And one other thing I want to say is one of the first ever bits of information I learned about it was a book called Hope and Help for Your Nerves by Claire Weekes. It was written in the 70s, I think, Australian doctor. And they could have just stopped there. Like you didn't need to read any other anxiety books. If you're suffering with anxiety, read that one, because she talks about the fact that if you imagine yourself laying in a nice warm ocean somewhere, the salt water would support you and lift you out of the water, right? Like you'd be able to float. But much like sinking sand, if you start thrashing around and trying to fight the ocean or change position all the time, you're just going to sink, and then you lose that situation. So with anxiety, we have to absolutely be at one with it. And what I mean is you can't avoid it. You can't bypass it. You can't like take some magic limitless drug to keep working 18 hours a day and not sleeping and get around it. You have to face it. You have to embrace it and move towards it and look at it and say, like, this is part of me. And I'm not going to hate it. I'm going to just give it a hug and say, right, how can we move through this together? And I think that analogy of floating is like the best thing ever to picture it and say that you just need to kind of really understand what's going on in your life and listen.
Okay, we do have to roll into the impact round soon, but
Okay.
I have one more because there's just so much stuff here. What I hear you say, people know deep down, and I completely believe you. I think when we look at areas of our life, we know, whatever we want to call it, gut feeling, intuition, it's there. And then we put all these stories around it to talk ourselves out of it. How do you get someone to trust that, to trust their intuition, to trust that gut feeling is there nagging at them?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of requalify one thing, although I don't know if everybody knows deep down what it is, in that they can say, well, it's this. If I was being really honest, it's this thing. I don't know if that's the fact, but what I do know is that it's definitely in somebody's story somewhere. They might need help to extract it. They might not be able to see it even. But if you go through their life and our stories about difficult things, then often people will say, well, yeah, this thing happened to me one time, or my mum always says this to me. And for them, it's just like something they've been sort of cultured to just find as normal. But I'm like, oh, I don't say it at the time, but I'm thinking like, that's it. That's the thing. So yeah, what your question was, like, what do they do about that? Or
just to get them to trust it when there is something that they have a knowing about, to trust that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. When I kind of open my eyes up, and if I'd never had a panic attack, to be honest, I probably wouldn't be having this conversation with you today, because I would have stayed on the corporate treadmill. You know, I'd be vice president of sales or a CEO by now, because I am like type A in many ways and very high functioning and good at what I do. So I definitely would have just stayed on that track and got to a different destination. Once I had my eyes open to it, I could see in so many areas of my life that I was doing things that weren't serving me, but because of the money and the success and the other things, I kept ignoring them, because I kept thinking like, okay, how could I possibly change jobs? I've been doing this for 15 years at this point. I can't change to a different career. People absolutely do have to sort of trust it and kind of move toward doing the first easy thing to make a change and see if that makes a difference for them.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I got to keep you on time because I promised I'd
Yeah.
have you get here in an hour. So we're going to move
Appreciate
into our impact round, series of short questions. First one, are you a cat or a dog person?
Dog, 100%. I'm allergic to cats.
All right. Okay, we normally ask this to veterinarians, but true or false? So I'll insert realtor here. I knew I wanted to be a realtor since I was a kid.
No, I didn't. False. Didn't know that. I actually, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a lumberjack. So yeah, it didn't work out.
How would your friends describe what you do for a living?
My friends would describe, helping people buy and sell houses, I suppose, like pretty simple stuff. Yeah.
What is your favorite hobby?
Currently jiu-jitsu. Yeah. Long-term hockey, but currently jiu-jitsu.
What in this world are you most grateful for?
Oh, such a great question. Most grateful for my family, just because that's what makes everything worthwhile, ultimately. But sitting in second place, most worthwhile for the resources we have and the ability to change and do something different.
Okay, thanks so much, Tim. I'm excited. I'm excited to unleash you onto the veterinary world. For everyone listening, the Anxiety Podcast by Tim J.P. Collins, go check it out. Also, if you are looking, he is a realtor in Nanaimo. Is that where you're based out of, Vancouver Island?
Yeah, Vancouver Island, that's right, yeah.
For those of our listeners that want to track you down, where would be the best place for them to follow you, to reach out, to connect?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say Instagram, Tim J.P. Collins on Instagram. Any significant changes in my life are probably going to happen there. I used to be a lot more active on social media. I'm not these days because I feel better when I'm not on it. So I don't go on it very much.
That's maybe the best answer I've ever heard for why someone isn't on social media very often.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, we have one more question for you, Tim. I want to give Jonathan a chance here if he's got anything to add before we get you out of here.
Just a big thank you for coming on. I know you and Mike are connecting there for a while, so thanks for spending the time with us. Very appreciate it, and this will be very valuable for our listeners out there.
Thanks for having me, yeah.
All right, Tim, as always, the final word goes to you. What message do you want to leave for the veterinary community?
Yeah, that's a big one. Ultimately, say my message, as we've talked about a lot on this podcast, is to listen to your intuition and don't be afraid to make a change, because long term, it can have such massive impact on your life.
Thank you for listening to the Veterinary Project Podcast. As a recap, on behalf of our hosts, the Veterinary Project Podcast will be releasing new episodes weekly. So be sure to tune in as we bring you more conversations aimed at helping you enjoy a life well lived. If you enjoyed what you heard on the show and you want to stay in the know, please like, love, and or subscribe to the podcast on the listening platform of your choosing, as we're available on all the usual suspects. If you know of others that may benefit from these conversations, we'd love it if you please share the show with them, as this will help us grow our community to reach more and more veterinary professionals. Speaking of which, if you are a veterinary professional and would like to get connected with more like-minded individuals who are joining us on this journey, please send an email to the veterinaryprojectpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll invite you to be a part of our private Facebook group. General feedback, requests for information, or perhaps requests to be a guest on the show can also be sent to the veterinaryprojectpodcast@gmail.com. Dr. Michael Bugg and Dr. Jonathan Light, thank you for listening to the show, and we'll catch you again next week for another episode of the Veterinary Project Podcast. Bye for now.